They moved from the plaza into the tower and paused on the front steps. They entered the glass doors and crossed the high marble lobby together. People continued moving around them, keeping steady pace and ignoring the pair's presence. One of the men asked about a brother and listened for an answer. The younger man produced a business card, and the older man took it with a nod. At the reception, they signed a visitor log and handed over identification. A clerk glanced at the card, confirmed details, and tapped a terminal. Security cameras tracked their path as they followed the corridor toward the elevators. Voices from distant offices filtered through the atrium and brushed against them. The detainee kept his composure while his inner voice muttered old doubts beneath the surface. The pair boarded an elevator and rose past mirrored panels toward a higher floor. They stepped out into a silent hallway and walked toward a distant office door. They moved from the plaza into the tower and paused on the front steps. They passed through glass doors and crossed the marble lobby while others flowed around them. At reception, they presented identification and signed the visitor book. A clerk checked a business card and confirmed their names on a terminal. Security cameras recorded their route as they followed a corridor toward an elevator. The detainee kept his composure while his inner voice muttered doubts. The pair rode upward and stepped into a silent hallway. A young woman called out and named Hiram. She approached and asked if one of the men was the manager's son and if he attended high school. Her recognition surprised them. She mentioned having something to deliver, then turned and headed toward a side door labeled cleaners. The two men exchanged looks and followed at her pace. They passed through the lobby, presented identification, and signed the visitor log before cameras recorded their route. A clerk matched names on a terminal while they walked a corridor to an elevator. The detainee kept his composure as the inner voice murmured doubts. They boarded and rose in silence. One man sighed as the floor changed. A young woman addressed Hiram and mentioned a delivery, then moved toward a side door marked cleaners. The two men exchanged looks and followed. The elevator opened onto a wide-open office filled with desks and staff. Workers and reporters fell quiet and stared as the pair stepped in. Conversation halted when someone called out Woojin, and every head swiveled toward them. They signed the visitor log and rode the elevator toward the office floor. Two men exchanged a brief aside before stepping into the busy workspace. Workers and reporters froze mid-task and turned now to face the newcomers. A voice called Woojin and attention, then snapped to a central aisle. A young woman moved forward and greeted the visitor with a quick smile. Shin Woojin stood quiet and met her gaze there with careful restraint. The two men lingered near the doorway while others whispered and observed. An elevator indicator and a wall clock confirmed the time as 11 a.m. Eyes followed them as they moved deeper into the office toward a side corridor. The detainee remained composed during the movement while his inner voice murmured doubts. After signing the visitor log, they rode the elevator up to the office floor. Workers and reporters paused their tasks and turned as the newcomers entered the busy space. Attention snapped to a central aisle when someone called Shin Woojin's name across the room. Young woman stepped forward and greeted Shin Woojin with a practiced smile and steady composure. Shin Woojin kept his expression measured and met young woman's gaze without speaking for several beats. Young woman observed him closely and cataloged small details with a quiet, calculating focus. Inner voice narrated judgments and plans in a low, mocking cadence only he could feel. Nearby office workers formed brief rings of observers and whispered among themselves. Young woman stepped closer, spoke a short line, then watched Shin Woojin turn and walk away. He offered a soft "see you" and left down the corridor without hesitation. The woman called out abruptly and startled the room with a sharp exclamation. They signed the visitor log and took the elevator to the office floor. Workers and reporters paused and watched as young woman approached Shin Woojin across the busy room. He kept his expression steady and turned away after a brief silence. The woman called out, and the space filled with low murmurs. She followed him into the corridor and accused him of skipping class. Shin Woojin said he would not go to school and began to walk away. Young woman demanded he stop and insisted she had checked the shop twice. Her gaze tightened while inner voice offered low mocking commentary only he could hear. She closed the distance and shifted from observation to direct confrontation. Then she declared she was the company's CEO's daughter and watched him. The office fell silent and observers strained for his reply. Shin's eyes narrowed and he paused to consider how to answer. They had exchanged terse remarks before she raised her voice and provoked him. Shin Woojin refused to linger and said he would not speak with her. She cut closer, eyes sharpening, and asked what would happen if she revealed her identity. Young woman then declared she was the company's CEO's daughter to test him. Observers fell silent as inner voice offered mocking commentary only Shin Woojin could hear. He feigned indifference and mentally prepared to display a subtle expression as instructed. Shin widened his eyes slightly and replied with dry skepticism, asking if that changed anything. The woman waited for impact while office murmurs strained for his next move. Tension hung in the corridor as both measured each other's intentions and resolve. They walked toward one another across the lobby while the office watched in muted interest. Shin Woojin kept his step steady and avoided landing his gaze directly on her. Close cuts showed her purple eyes, then his plain sneakers as they neared. She broke the quiet with a pointed question about whether he was in school. He replied tersely that he was not. She smiled and said that timing was perfect before asking him to hang out with her that day. Her expression tightened into a controlled, mocking smile, and the corner of her mouth curled with deliberate amusement. Inner voice supplied a single contemptuous label for her motive: greed. Shin composed himself, prepared the subtle expression he had rehearsed, and let the moment hang between them. Shin kept the rehearsed expression and watched her with measured detachment across the lobby. He told himself he could turn her hunger into leverage and guide her choices. The thought of controlling her felt clinical rather than cruel in his mind. He pictured her like a marionette and rehearsed the small gestures he would use. He suggested they grab food in an ordinary tone and watched her respond. She agreed and led him through the lobby while she kept a fixed smile. He offered no questions about the destination and let her control the plan. He noted that she refused to share details and accepted that secrecy as leverage. Inner voice murmured contempt and catalogued motives while Shin refined his approach. He followed her lead while keeping subtle cues ready to steer her decisions. By the time they reached the staircase, he had resolved to act with quiet patience. Shin kept his rehearsed expression and watched her with measured detachment at the table. He allowed her to guide the exchange while he catalogued small cues and motives. She said she was preparing for the civil service exam and studied instead of attending school. When he asked why she had left early, she answered it was that time of the month. He responded in a calm clinical tone about the uterine lining responding to hormones and cycles. Her face went from casual to startled as his explanation landed. Inner voice noted the break in her composure and ranked his options silently. Shin observed her blush and adjusted his approach, choosing patience while he gathered leverage from small admissions. Shin maintained his composed expression and continued to catalog small cues as the waiter returned. The waiter asked if they were ready to order, and the woman deferred, leaving Shin to note their overlapping courses and study materials. She offered no choice when he probed the options, and he watched her composure shift and then settle. He asked her name in a controlled voice. She replied plainly, Shin Woojin. He registered the name and made a mild, approving remark. Papers lay between them as an awkward silence grew. He observed her hands and breathing for leverage and held his questions. When he finally asked if she was always so quiet, she answered with a single word. He accepted that answer and catalogued avenues to use later. Shin Woojin kept a neutral face and catalogued small cues as the waiter returned with plates. The woman muttered that the meeting was boring and drew a bored expression. The waiter, startled, apologized and stepped back, visibly embarrassed by his abrupt movement. Shin accepted the apology with a brief pause and a flat response of "It's fine." A companion teased that it was that time of the month and prodded her reaction. Another voice questioned her sincerity and suggested there was a high probability she lied. The man reached out and patted her head in a casual, mocking gesture. Small objects lay on the table, unnoticed details that Shin stored as future leverage. She adjusted her hair and met the room with a steady blankness. Shin measured their tones and timings, filing the exchange into his internal list of avenues to exploit later. After the waiter returned, Shin Woojin kept a neutral face and catalogued small cues. She reached under the low table and slid up a few coins. A companion noticed and reached across, fingers resting briefly on her head. He asked what she was doing and whether something was wrong. Shin met his voice with a blank stare and offered only a soft denial. He said she looked tired and suggested she warm the food before it cooled. The exchange was gentle and practical. She accepted the suggestion and nodded. He arranged the table and moved to heat the food while she watched, counting tones and timings in silence. A soft mouth movement preceded a small startled sound that broke the room's quiet. Shin pocketed the moment into her memory, along with the coins and gestures she could later use. After the waiter returned, Shin Woojin kept a composed face and noted small cues. She slid a few coins from beneath the table and hid them in her palm. The waiter spoke with practiced warmth and praised the soup's familiar taste. The companion seized the moment and called it a successful bait. He steered the talk to a recent visit to a K restaurant and asked who had joined her. He then name-checked Kim Yina to provoke a reaction. Shin answered briefly and denied knowing the actress. The companion teased her about living under a rock. The talk softened into memory sharing when he evoked fireworks over Gwangangan Bridge. Shin agreed and described the display as pure art. She filed the exchange among gestures and sounds for later use. After the waiter returned, Shin Woojin kept a composed face and hid a few coins beneath the table. Her companion called the exchange a successful bait and prodded for names to unsettle her. He name-checked Kim Yina, and Shin denied any connection to the actress. Memories of fireworks surfaced when he mentioned Gwangangan Bridge that night. Her body and brain flooded with dopamine and adrenaline from the recall. A simple thought of a lemon made her mouth water without conscious control. Though seated in the restaurant, she behaved as if aboard a yacht under fireworks. The companion guided her pace, tone, and gestures and observed every change. By aligning small prompts, he became a steady trigger for her pleasure that evening. He smiled with controlled warmth while she laughed and relaxed into the memory. The waiter returned with practiced timing and asked about their conversation and motives. The waiter returned, and Shin Woojin kept her face composed while tucking a few coins under the table. Her companion treated the exchange as bait and prodded for names to unsettle her. He name-checked Kim Yina and mentioned Gwangangan Bridge the night of the fireworks. The memory flooded Shin with dopamine and adrenaline, and the thought of lemon made her mouth water. Though seated in the cafe, she felt transported by fireworks and the sea imagery. The companion guided her tone and gestures and observed every small change. He aligned tiny prompts until he became a steady trigger for her pleasure that evening. The waiter returned with practiced timing and asked about their motives and their talk. When the topic turned to trips, the companion urged her to visit an island called Wallan. He described the beach night sky thick with stars and waves that sparkled as they rolled. The image bloomed in Shin's head, and her pupils tightened into a visible start. She then excused herself abruptly, saying she needed to go and study. The waiter returned, and Shin Woojin kept her face composed while tucking coins away. The friend prodded with baited questions and name-checked Kim Yina and Gwangangan Bridge. Those references flooded Shin with dopamine and adrenaline and a sudden lemon memory. Though they remained in the cafe, she felt transported to fireworks and the sea. The friend aligned tiny prompts until he acted as a steady trigger for pleasure. The waiter's timing returned to the scene and asked about motives and travel plans. The friend painted an island called Wallan with stars and waves that sparkled. The image bloomed in Shin's head, and her pupils tightened into a visible start. She excused herself abruptly, claiming she needed to study, and then left. The friend called after her for a number, but she deflected with a pointed tease. Inner voice assessed her attachments and family bonds and planned exploitation. It resolved that by exploiting those needs, it could own what she had learned and seen. The friend handed over his phone, and the waiter paused nearby as Shin Woojin accepted it. He seeded the conversation with names like Kim Yina and Gwangangan Bridge to lure her memory. Those references sparked a vivid rush of pleasure and a lemon scent that unsettled her. While they sat, she felt transported to fireworks and the sea despite remaining in the cafe. The friend kept nudging with small prompts until her pupils tightened and she broke away. She excused herself, claiming she needed to study, and left quickly down the street. He called after her for a number, and she deflected him with a teasing remark. An inner voice assessed her attachments and planned to exploit them to control what she had learned. Outside, she hesitated at the curb while he pressed her about where she lived, then shouted, "Hey!" Across the street, a lone figure lingered near a building entrance and watched without moving. They hesitated at the curb while the friend prodded her for details. Across the street, a lone watcher lingered by a building entrance without moving. A shout cut through the air, and a passerby cried someone had been stabbed. They turned into the narrow alley and found a man slumped against the wall. Blood darkened his shirt, and a bystander pressed at a shallow wound. Another voice urged them not to look and warned of danger ahead. A figure turned and fled deeper into the alley as shoes pounded the pavement. The friend bolted after him while she froze, eyes fixed on the scene. Her pupil reflected the injured man, bright blood rimmed in the iris. The alley emptied as the chase continued, and the watcher vanished back into shade. They hesitated at the curb while the friend prodded her for details. Across the street, a lone watcher lingered by a building entrance without moving. A shout cut through the air, and someone cried that someone had been stabbed. They turned into the narrow alley and found a man slumped against the wall. Blood darkened his shirt, and a bystander pressed at a shallow wound. Shoes pounded the pavement as the friend bolted after a fleeing figure into shade. She froze, eyes fixed on the injured man, her pupil reflecting the bright blood. The alley emptied while the watcher vanished without explanation into deeper shadow. A young man sprinted forward, knelt, and applied steady pressure over the wound. He called emergency services, relayed the location, and begged the police to hurry. He watched the victim's wrist and felt the pulse race beneath his fingers. A cold inner note warned the cerebellum had increased heart rate from blood loss. He tightened his grip as distant sirens began to rise toward the alley. The young man knelt and forced the victim's shirt open to check wounds and pulse. He asked the victim his blood type while assessing the abdomen's puncture. The victim muttered a B type, then faltered as pain and blood took hold. The rescuer recognized a deep abdominal stab, causing severe hemorrhage and shock. He ordered a transfusion urgently and relayed the blood type to dispatch. He instructed bystanders to lay the victim flat and to prop his legs. He pressed both hands into the gaping wound to staunch the bleeding. Sirens climbed closer, and the rescuer's palms grew slick with dark blood. He kept a steady grip and told the ambulance exactly where they stood as an inner voice urged him to hold on. The young man knelt and forced the fallen man's shirt open to check wounds. He checked the pulse and probed the abdomen for a puncture wound. He asked the fallen man his blood type while stabilizing him. The fallen man muttered B, then faltered as pain and blood overwhelmed him. The young man recognized a deep stab to the abdomen, causing severe hemorrhage and shock. He ordered an urgent transfusion and relayed the blood type to dispatch. He instructed bystanders to lay the fallen man flat and to prop his legs. He pressed both hands into the gaping wound to staunch the bleeding. Sirens drew closer as his palms grew slick with dark blood. He kept a steady grip and told the ambulance their exact location while the inner voice urged him to hold on. The young woman stared with purple eyes and clutched her phone. The young man's expression hardened, and he thought that living an ordinary life was really hard. The young man knelt beside the fallen man and opened his shirt to examine the wound. He checked pulse and probed the abdomen for a puncture. He asked for the blood type. The fallen man muttered B and deteriorated as blood overwhelmed him. The young man recognized severe hemorrhage and ordered an urgent transfusion over the phone. He pressed both hands into the gaping wound to staunch bleeding. He instructed bystanders to lay the patient flat and raise his legs. Sirens grew louder and red lights flashed as the ambulance neared. He relayed the exact location to dispatch while the inner voice taunted him to hold on. The young woman stood shocked with her phone clenched. He kept a steady grip and thought that living an ordinary life was hard. Crowds gathered and first responders arrived to take over treatment. After the young man staunched the wound and summoned help, a police officer questioned him beside the ambulance. The young man gave a precise description: short hair, gray cap, black-collared t-shirt, blue jeans, about 180 centimeters, carrying books. The officer confirmed details and asked whether he was a student. A sketch was prepared from the account while first responders readied the patient for transport. A young woman stood at the curb watching, phone clenched, as the ambulance prepared to depart. The crowd thinned, but the mood remained charged. The scene then cut to a masked figure in a cap and mask brandishing a knife. A schoolgirl recoiled, hands over her mouth, eyes wide with terror. The reveal connected the witness description to a menacing attacker moving through the city. After the sketch and questioning, the street scene tightened around an ambulance and a small girl who suddenly fell into shock. Bystanders circled and called out, while a police officer and responders moved forward. The young man steadied the child, spoke softly, and assessed her briefly as the crew readied her for transport. He believed he could comfort Hiram like a parent in that moment and felt irreplaceable. The young woman remained at the curb with her phone clenched as the ambulance doors closed. One responder offered calm reassurances that the child was safe now. The police officer continued recording witness notes, while reporters kept distance and traffic lanes remained blocked to clear a path for the crew. After the ambulance departed, the young man and young woman exchanged quiet words on the curb. He told her the child would be safe and that no one would recognize them. The young woman kept her phone clutched and breathed shallowly as she listened. Hiram pressed against her chest and fell asleep as tension eased slightly. They spoke of CCTV and the culprits likely capture without lingering on details. Night fell and they drove to a large house set back from the street. The driveway and facade glowed under soft lights as traffic noises faded. Inside the house, the rooms were empty and the lamps cast thin pools. Corridors led to a dim bedroom where a shower or faucet sprayed steady water. The sound filled the house and left a cold, waiting silence behind it. After they reached the house, they allowed themselves a brief rest in silence. The young woman stepped into the dim bathroom and let the shower run over her hair. Steam rose and water drummed, masking small, distant noises from outside the house. Hiram slept against her chest, and the young man moved through the rooms on edge. He looked toward the dark driveway and suddenly found a fallen figure at the curb. He dragged the stranger to the pavement and shouted for her not to look. His shout cut through the night and froze her beneath the running water. He added that the stranger did not seem badly hurt and told her not to worry. She stayed under the spray while he guarded the threshold and watched the street. They reached the house and paused to rest for a few minutes. The young woman stepped into the dim bathroom and let the hot shower run over her hair. Steam rose and muffled distant street sounds while Hiram slept against her chest. The young man moved through the rooms on edge and watched the dark driveway. He found a fallen stranger at the curb and dragged her toward the pavement. His warning cut through the night and kept the stranger from looking up. She stayed under the spray as he guarded the threshold and kept watch. After rinsing, she dressed in an oversized shirt and walked barefoot across the floor to the dressing table. She smoothed her hair, stared into the mirror, and paused with the phone on the table. A message bubble then reminded her that she had never asked an important question. Night settled over the block, and the camera lingered on flat roofs and metal railings. A single window glowed and offered a narrow view into a dim room below. Inside the room, the young woman lay on her back and held her phone above her. She scrolled through a livestream where a host praised a dish and shared seasoning tips. Comments scrolled upward and reacted to the host, calling the seasoning divine and addictive. She read with mild interest and kept her thought about the unanswered question to herself. Her eyes widened when a soft notification tone pulsed and the phone lit the ceiling. She glanced toward the doorway and then down at the screen, uncertain how to respond. The small display held the moment while the night stayed quiet around her. Night had settled over the block, and she lay on her back scrolling a live stream. The young woman held the phone above her and watched a host praise a dish and reveal seasoning tips. Comments scrolled upward while she read them with mild interest but no reply. A soft notification tone pulsed, and her eyes widened at the sudden light. She glanced once toward the doorway, then back down at the screen, uncertain. A small chat thread filled the display, and an unanswered question appeared. She typed a brief reply, saying she was going to bed, and sent it. The stream cut to a close-up of meat, and she remarked on marbling. Then the phone chimed again, and a new message from Hiram arrived in green. She stared at the terse text, and the room stayed quiet around her. She had been lying in the dim room and scrolling a live stream when a notification pulsed. The young woman had held the phone above her and watched the host and comments. A short green message from Hiram had arrived, and she had typed a brief reply before the stream cut. Morning had come, and a clear square of sky had filled a small panel. A plane had crossed that frame. At the low table, the family had gathered and eaten together in quiet. Simple courtesies had been exchanged, and faces had brightened over the meal. Hiram had shown up and greeted the visitors with a warm smile. The sequence had shifted to a photo of a narrow stairwell and a cropped corridor. Nearby, a neat stack of papers and a small booklet had sat on a table. The images had moved the day from private screens toward an actual plan. The day shifted from private screens toward an actual plan as morning filled the small room. Shin Woojin sat at the low table and resumed his notes with steady pen strokes. He picked up a compact notebook and paused with his eyes on the page. A short green notification pulsed on his phone, and a caller name briefly lit the glass. He let the message remain unread, following his own rule about ordinary life. When the phone rang, he watched it on the desk and did not answer. He returned his focus to margins and schedules and let the work guide him. A moment later, he looked to the window and noticed a bird perched on the nearby wire. The quiet scene affirmed a peaceful, ordinary morning before the next steps unfolded. The morning moved from private screens toward a quiet plan in the small room. Shin Woojin sat at the low table and resumed his notes with steady pen strokes. He picked up a compact notebook and paused, eyes fixed on the page. A short green notification pulsed on his phone. The caller name briefly lit the glass, but he kept the message unread by his rule. When the phone rang, he watched it on the desk and did not immediately answer. He returned his focus to margins and schedules, letting work guide his hands again and mapping out the day. The ringtone persisted and finally drew him to pick up the handset. A woman introduced herself as team leader Kim Mi-young from XX Capital, speaking in a steady, measured tone. He registered the name and the implication with cautious disbelief. He asked aloud if he had won something, his voice small in the ordinary room. The call left him unsettled and curious about the next steps. Shin Woojin had started the day at the low table and kept his phone face down. He earlier had received a steady call from Kim Mi-young that left him unsettled. The ringtone later pulsed again, and a speaker warned that 10 billion won was needed. Shin froze and mouthed the figure aloud before inwardly planning a response. He told himself he could handle it and reached for the handset. The screen showed an incoming call labeled Officer Lee Sang-chul from the police station. A formal voice identified itself and asked if he was the reporting student. Shin answered yes and confirmed that he was fine despite lingering worry. The officer said they would come by, and Shin watched the room from the window. Shin Woojin had begun the day at the low table with his phone face down. A call from Kim Mi-young unsettled him, and a recorded voice later demanded 10 billion won. He froze, then reached for the handset when an incoming call showed Officer Lee Sang-chul. He confirmed he was fine, and the officer said they would come by. Shin watched the empty room through the window before he moved to leave. He walked through the living space, shut lights, and opened the apartment door. He paused at the threshold and stepped into the dim corridor with the door half open. The young woman called back and promised she would return soon. Her face showed red eyes, and his brief relief was edged with worry. A quick flash of memory reminded him of a time he had been late. He closed the door with a measured hand and headed down the hall. Shin Woojin left the apartment after the young woman promised she would return soon. He crossed the narrow hall past shoes and a few neighbors conversing in muted tones. He stepped onto the building roof, where sparse birds circled beneath an ash-colored sky. Clouds thickened and distant thunder rolled over the block. Police cars gathered below with engines idling near the building's main entrance. Officers stood by the vehicles and watched the tower quietly for movement. Inside the school, the corridor lay empty, light panels casting narrow rectangles on tile. Investigators later reviewed footage and noted the suspect's face was obscured by a hat. They instructed analysts to focus on cellular frequency logs to trace the call origin. Shin kept his phone silent and watched the sky as sirens cut through distant noise. The inquiry continued inside an interview room where a detained suspect sat behind glass. Detectives referenced earlier footage and the cellular frequency logs while they questioned him. They offered to play a recorded voice sample and an officer reached for a playback device. The suspect folded his hands and asked why he should listen. He said he did not know the alleged victim and denied involvement. Investigators suggested matching tones and timing against call traces and pressed for any reaction. A technician tapped the player and a faint voice filled the booth. A watcher observed through the one-way glass, eyes fixed on the suspect's face. The suspect's expression tightened as the recording reached him, and he repeated that he would not harm someone he did not know. The interrogation resumed inside the booth as the suspect faced the detectives and the playback device. He denied knowing the victim and refused the premise of the questioning. He thrust his hands forward and demanded the officers look at the cuts. He claimed the wounds came from cooking and pleaded that blood stains were accidental. His voice sharpened when he challenged them, insisting he would not harm a stranger. A technician behind the glass started the recorded sample, and the booth filled with a faint voice. A watcher watched him through the one-way glass and kept his eyes fixed on the suspect's face. The suspect's expression tightened as the recording reached a cadence he could not ignore. The detectives exchanged quiet looks and withheld comment while the recording finished. Silence settled briefly in the room after the playback had fully ended. The interrogation resumed inside the booth as the playback completed and silence settled. The suspect had denied knowing the victim and refused the detective's premise. He thrust his hands forward and demanded the officers examine the cuts. A technician started the recorded sample, and a faint voice filled the booth. A watcher kept his eyes fixed on the suspect through the one-way glass. The suspect's face tightened as the recording reached an undeniable cadence. Detectives exchanged looks but withheld comment while the playback finished. Silence settled briefly after the tape ended, and the room held its breath. Then the silence broke when a figure inside the booth spoke plainly. He declared that the suspect was lying right now without hesitation. The declaration shifted the room's energy and demanded an immediate reaction. The interrogation resumed with the suspect insisting on his innocence and pushing his hands forward. He demanded the officers examine the cuts and kept repeating his denial. A technician started the recorded sample, and a faint voice played through the booth speakers. A watcher stared at the suspect through the one-way glass without moving. The playback reached a clear cadence, and the suspect's face tightened while detectives exchanged looks. Silence settled after the tape ended, and everyone waited for someone to speak. A man behind the glass stood up and asked what they thought after hearing the recording. He walked around the consoles and faced the table. He showed his face and declared plainly that the suspect was lying right now. The statement changed the room's tone and forced the detectives to react immediately. The interrogation had resumed, and the suspect continued to insist loudly on his innocence. Officers initiated a recorded playback while a watcher stood motionless behind the one-way glass. The tape produced a clear cadence, and detectives shifted in their seats, exchanging tense glances. Outside the building, two voices debated whether that man matched the description given earlier. From the booth, the silhouetted speaker delivered a flat statement claiming he walked the neighborhood. Cameras cut to close-ups of his hands and face showing, repeated nose rubbing and lip biting. Narration explained catecholamine release, raised blood pressure, and generated facial itchiness during deceptive states. It then noted chewing lips and touching the mouth were unconscious behaviors linked to anxiety. When threatened, people adopted 3 responses: freeze, flee, or fight, and he chose to freeze. The interrogation had resumed as officers replayed the recorded statement while a watcher observed motionless behind one-way glass. Detectives noted the man's repetitive nose rubbing and lip biting. They considered catecholamine release a cause of facial itchiness during deception. Analysts proposed he might choose to freeze under psychological pressure rather than act. They mapped his motions mathematically to predict nonverbal cues revealing fear about exposure. Outside, colleagues compared reports and debated whether his profile matched prior descriptions. The team reasoned higher education would make logical evidence more persuasive for him. If he were the culprit, he would prioritize DNA and eyewitness testimony over emotion. They planned to claim an eyewitness to increase psychological pressure and prompt a confession. Shin Woojin had only seen the scene from a distance, yet his sighting might still matter. Officers resumed the interrogation and replayed earlier key recordings behind one-way glass. A watcher remained motionless while detectives watched the suspect carefully for micro-expressions. The lead detective declared belief that the man was the culprit and pressed his case. Shin Woojin asked to leave after his short appearance, and the officer consented. The officer offered to walk Shin Woojin out, but he declined and moved away. Inside the room, the suspect mentally repeated that there was no evidence or witnesses. He began to panic at the thought of exposure and lack of alibi. Detectives used that tension and prepared a psychological confrontation to force disclosure. At the door, an officer opened it and announced an eyewitness had been found. The revelation aimed to increase pressure and potentially extract a confession from him. Officers resumed the interrogation and replayed earlier key recordings behind one-way glass. A watcher remained motionless while detectives watched the suspect carefully for micro-expressions. The lead detective declared belief that the man was the culprit and pressed his case. Shin Woojin asked to leave after his short appearance, and the officer consented. The officer offered to walk Shin Woojin out, but he declined and moved away. Inside the room, the suspect mentally repeated that there was no evidence or witnesses. He began to panic at the thought of exposure and lack of alibi. Detectives used that tension and prepared a psychological confrontation to force disclosure. At the door, an officer opened it and announced an eyewitness had been found. A young man entered, and the detective registered surprise at the arrival. The suspect curled and groaned with mounting distress. Under sharp questioning, he muttered that his act had been impulsive and not planned as a murder. Detectives pressed for clarity but supplied no certainty. Outside the precinct, Shin Woojin lingered near the plaza, reflecting on the sudden turn. After the interrogation inside, Shin Woojin lingered near the precinct plaza and watched the courtyard.